Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Kuderna podcast. I'm Bryan Kuderna. So I know we had a bit of a break here. That was by design. We've taken a hiatus here from recording, and it was with good intent. We have a lot of really cool stuff that's going to be coming out this summer, some awesome guests that we'll have here on the show, and some new content based on a lot of the feedback that I've received. So it was a little bit of a retweaking, but again, it'll be the same old podcast that so many of you loyal listeners are used to. And again, for any new subscribers, this is the show where we discuss all things wealth in its original meaning, and that is a state of well-being. We cover everything from personal finance, economics, business, health, wealth, all the above, anything to get you moving in the right direction. We want to address it here on the Kuderna podcast. Now, today, I really felt compelled to interrupt this little break that we've had because I've been doing a lot of speaking engagements lately, particularly to younger audiences. These are graduate students, people recently out of college, folks that are working in their 20s to early 30s. And what I like to do when I do a lot of these seminars is introduce a little bit about economics, understanding why things are the way they are. And then we dive into the different topics of personal finance and such. But as I do that little entree about economics, I've heard a lot of responses from the audience that have surprised me. And they're recurring ones. It seems to be some of the same answers I hear that are a slight cause for concern. And so I was like, you know what? I want to jump back in here and have an episode that I think will be informative to everyone. It'll be quick, succinct, and get you some information that I think all of us ought to be aware of. So today's episode is titled, Where Do Our Tax Dollars Go? Now, why did this come about? So a lot of these presentations that I give, a common question or topic that folks want to go over, again, especially young professionals, is student loans. In particular, are my student loans going to get forgiven? And so when we start to address this topic, this type of audience usually reacts in such a way that they only see a positive benefit by forgiving student loans. And they're looking at it like, man, I'm just entering the workforce, just getting started with my adult life. I'm swimming through student loan debt. Wouldn't it be great if it was forgiven? And then I could move on with life, with my career, perhaps start a family, become a first-time home buyer, a productive citizen in our economy. And from that standpoint, of course, that all sounds good. But in reality, as they say in economics, there is no free lunch. And this is a huge outstanding debt to our government that is owed. And so naturally, if we were to just wipe clear that debt, that is money that needs to be replaced somewhere. Either we're going to have to cut another expenditure for the U.S. budget, or we're going to have to find a new revenue source to replace all of that lost income to the government. So we can't be too narrow-minded. We need to see both sides of the coin here. And that's what we're going to get into today, so we can see what we can do as far as forgiving debt and perhaps what we can't do, and just simply what's feasible. The other question, somewhat relevant to that, as we start to get into, what's our government capable of, I often poll the audience, what is the biggest line item on the U.S. federal budget? And I would say, at least in recent memory, 9 times out of 10, the response I get is defense spending, which is incorrect. So I felt like that ought to be addressed. And then when I say, no, that's not it, anybody have any other suggestions, I kind of get a whole smattering of different ideas. And oftentimes it takes quite a while before we actually get the right answers. So I think this is critical. We need to know what are the biggest line items for the U.S. government, so we can be a more informed voter, taxpayer, and citizen here in our economy. So I'm going to, in a moment, just kind of lay out the landscape of what the U.S. budget and financial picture looks like today, the good, the bad, the ugly. And then we'll come back to, those two questions that I've spent a lot of time discussing over the past month or two.
Is going to require work and time and sweat and toil.
If money wasn't an issue, what would I be doing?
Don't worry about it. You'll figure it out.
Change is the only constant.
The Kuderna Podcast.
Again, everything I discussed today has to do with the U.S. federal budget. All right, this is not even touching state budgets, going down to local budgets and municipalities and cities and the like. That could be a whole nother episode. Today, we're just going to focus from the macro and look at the U.S. budget. So just to preface, I want to share something that's straight from the U.S. Treasury's website that says, according to the Constitution's preamble, the purpose of the federal government is to, quote, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, end quote. These goals are achieved through government spending. All right, that is straight from the Treasury's website. So keep those goals in mind as we start to talk about some of these government expenses that kind of make up our whole economy here. So first off, what happens is Congress every fiscal year, they come up with a budget. They go back and forth. There's tons of debating, figuring out, what's good, what's bad, what's feasible, what's not. And then that budget is then passed on to the executive branch, to the White House, and then the president signs off on that. And then we enter the fiscal year, okay, which starts every October. All right, so keep that in mind. It's not, just December to January, not the calendar year. This is a fiscal year. And then what happens is this budget obviously is filled up with inflows and outflows. So government spending primarily comes from two sources. Number one, we have tax revenue. And then number two, we have borrowing, which one we're going to get into in a second. So if we look at the most recent fiscal year, which was 2023, the federal government spent $6.13 trillion. Okay, pretty big sum. That's a lot of money. Now, year to date in fiscal year 2024, so as I record this episode, it's June of 2024. And so if we're looking from October up to June, so far we have spent $3.8 trillion the U.S. government has. That is 6% ahead of schedule from where we were this time last year. Okay, so we're spending a little more this year than we did last year. But then, everything's relative. If we look at tax revenue, okay, so those are our inflows. Tax revenue is $4.8 trillion, all right? And 2.3 of that came from income tax, and then 1.6 trillion came from payroll tax. Those are the two biggest sources of tax revenue to our U.S. government, is income tax and payroll tax. So as you see that, we're trending towards over a $6 trillion budget, and then our tax revenue is projected at $4.8 trillion. What that says is we actually go into the budget projecting a deficit. And to be more specific, this fiscal year's deficit is projected to be $1.98 trillion. Okay, so you think about that as a percentage of spending, how much of a shortfall that is, that should obviously raise some concerns. And so now you're saying, how is that even possible? If we're almost $2 trillion short of what's being spent, what happens? Again, that's where I said the two biggest sources of spending. We have tax revenue, but then we have borrowing. Okay, that's where that $2 trillion or so comes from, is I borrowed money. Now, you might be hearing some of these numbers and not understand, is that a lot or is that a little? I mean, obviously they sound massive, but again, everything's relative, which I'm going to keep coming back to. And if we look at just rewinding the clock a little bit, we hit an all-time high in the COVID years, okay, in 2020 and 2021, when we got near $8 trillion of spending in fiscal years 2020 and 2021. That was our all-time high in American history. Obviously, we're down from that right now, but not by much, and we're trending a little bit higher this year. So just to piggyback a little bit on the debt comment, okay, because we're obviously seeing how that plays a very big role in our government spending. Right now, as we speak, June of 2024, the U.S. national debt stands at $34.8 trillion. Okay. I want to repeat and underscore that number again, because again, this is another one of the ones when I introduce basics of economics at so many of the seminars I do, I poll the audience, how much debt do you think our country owes right now? And I hear everything from in the billions to 2 trillion numbers in that range. And then when I say it's 34.8 trillion, it's almost unfathomable. Okay, but that's a real number that our government is responsible for. So we got to recognize that. And again, to give context, if you're just hearing that and saying, wow, it's the biggest number I ever heard, but I still don't know, is that really good or bad? All right, if we just look back at the turn of the millennium, all right, so when we came into year 2000, the US national debt was 5.6 trillion. Okay, so now that will hopefully kind of, I would say raise some eyebrows, but certainly get your attention. All right, it was 5.6 trillion in year 2000. And now here we are just 24 years later, and it hasn't doubled, tripled, or quadrupled, but it's done much more and gone all the way up to $34.8 trillion of national debt. So let's try and look at this from, I don't want to be a pessimist here. If we look at the glass is half full, you could say, well, what about inflation? What about our economy? We still have the biggest economy in the entire world. Okay. You have US is number one, and then China, which has been growing rapidly, is number two. Okay. We are the two superpowers, if you will, of the globe. The US GDP right now is $28.45 trillion. Okay. That's the biggest GDP, or gross domestic product, in the world. But again, if we want to look at what I think really tell a clearer story, is looking at ratios, trying to make everything relative to see if that's good or bad. A ratio that I really like looking at, and I talk a lot about this in my book. If this is kind of interest but slightly confusing, my book, What Should I Do with My Money? Economic Insights to Build Wealth Amid Chaos. There's a lot of discussion about our US debt, our budget, and economy, and kind of how all those things fold together. So you could get a much deeper dive there. But again, to continue our kind of overview, in the year 2000, the US federal debt to GDP was 57.6%. Okay, so the total outstanding national debt versus our country's gross domestic product, all right, the debt was, just over half of the gross domestic product at 57.6%. Again, 24 years later, as it stands right now, as I record this episode, the U.S. federal debt to GDP ratio is 122.28%. Okay, that is a concern. There is no ifs, ands, or buts. There's no doubt about that. All right, like I said, the total debt, 34.8 trillion, total GDP, 28.45 trillion. That means that everything our country produces in the entire year is less than what we owe right now. Okay. And that's where we have that ratio again, 122%. All right. So I know I'm throwing out a lot of numbers. Your head might be spinning right now. You might have to just rewind for 5 minutes and just listen to this one more time. That's fine. But again, those are probably the most important numbers when you look at how is our country doing right now, just a financial gauge. Again, maybe give that another listen. And now we're going to pivot to the next segment of this episode and really talk about, well, where does it all go? We talked about a lot of tax revenue. We talked about a lot of borrowing. Okay, just to kind of use very rough numbers, about $4 trillion of tax revenue and almost $2 trillion of borrowing. All right, where does that go? This is the question, like I said at the outset, that I always kind of pose to the general public. And for one reason or another, maybe it's through popular media or conversation or hearsay, defense comes up as, without question, the most popular answer. And defense is big. The U.S. certainly spends more money on defense than any other country in the world. Okay, that's on all the branches of the military. That is true. But there are two line items that are even bigger than defense. All right. And if you're tuning in, this is your chance at Jeopardy to kind of guess those answers. All right. But to cut to the chase and give you the correct answer, number one is Medicare, Medicaid. So Medicare, Medicaid, the line item on our budget is $1.77 trillion. That's an annual expense earmarked for Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare, Medicaid is funded through our payroll taxes, through FICA taxes. And remember, Medicare, it's a health program for those over the age of 65. And then Medicaid is meant for lower income individuals or families, again, for their health care. All right. That is the number one expense for the US government. And it wasn't always that way. Number two, which used to be in the lead but has fallen behind, is Social Security. Social Security costs $1.43 trillion a year to the US government. Again, that also primarily comes through FICA taxes. And Social Security is the largest source of retiree income. All right, I spend a lot of time in a lot of my retirement planning conversations talking about Social Security for that exact reason. It's the number one source of retiree income. Roughly 1/3 of retiree income comes from Social Security. And I think one of the things people really need to recognize, especially amongst the baby boomer generation and what we're going to see following that, is Social Security was meant to be a supplement. It was never meant to be the primary source or only source. It was meant to be a supplement to help us as we age and enter those retirement years. But obviously now that's become kind of the king of the jungle in the retirement space. And if we look back at the genesis of Social Security, so if we rewind the clock all the way back to around World War II, when it was in its infancy and the program just came about, I won't get into all the numbers because I know we're going over a lot, but if you ever research the amount of tax-paying workers paying into the Social Security versus the number of beneficiaries, those collecting from the program, you'll see there was a huge disparity. A lot of people putting in, very few taking out at that time. Normal retirement age was 65 years old. Life expectancy in the 1940s, not all that high. So this was truly a supplement. It was doing what it was intended to do. Now here we are in 2024. If you go research that ratio again of tax-paying workers versus beneficiaries collecting, it has shrunken dramatically. And kind of spoiler alert here, the ratio is roughly 2-to-1. 2 tax-paying workers per 1 beneficiary. And right now, the latest normal retirement age for younger professionals out there, or those still working, can be age 67. And if you ever go look at a life expectancy chart today in 2024, I think that will tell you the whole story right there. We have less people putting in, more taking out, and taking out for much longer periods of time. And that simple math, if we look at the actuarial science right there, that explains why there's so much pressure on this type of entitlement. All right, so again, just to recap, number one, Medicare, Medicaid at almost $1.8 trillion a year, and then Social Security behind that at $1.4 trillion a year. And then coming in third place is everyone's favorite answer, apparently, defense spending. The U.S. government spends roughly $895 billion on defense. Okay, so certainly a huge number, but pales in comparison to our entitlements of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Now, number 4, and I don't think in all my seminars I've been doing this year, I've ever heard this response, but number 4, the biggest expense, the biggest line item on the U.S. government's budget is interest. Okay, that is something that I think is extremely alarming. The interest expense on our debt right now is $862 billion a year. All right, I'll say that again, $862 billion a year, not for any benefit, but purely to pay the interest on our outstanding debt. Okay, so hopefully as we hear all these different numbers and we start to absorb some of this data, it'll give us a better understanding of what's possible and what's not as we talk about the future of our country and our government, which has been getting bigger and bigger, obviously. So certainly, again, our GDP has been growing. All right, we still have the biggest GDP in the world, but our government spending has been growing much faster. Okay, if we simply look at those ratios I mentioned. So if we bring it all the way back to why these conversations often happen during my lectures, to young professionals, probably the biggest concern, student loan debt. Right now, June 2024, the outstanding student loan debt is roughly $1.7 trillion. Okay, that's a lot of money, especially for a young professional that hasn't even started their career in many instances, doesn't even have an income yet, That can be intimidating. All right. We think of other types of consumer debt, credit cards, which most people are familiar with. We have about $1.3 trillion of credit card debt. So student loan debt is now significantly higher than all the credit card debt in our country. So it's certainly a concern. But as we look at all the things that we discussed in today's episode, we have to ask, where does that 1.7 trillion fit into the picture? Okay. And at the end of the day, as complicated as some of this sometimes may sound, all it is inflows and outflows, basic math. We either need to cut expenses, which means we're going to stop spending on defense. We're going to stop spending on entitlements. And bear in mind, when we forgive debt, that is an expense. That's a liability the government's anticipating as revenue that would then disappear. That's a cost to the U.S. government, as the student loan pause all throughout COVID was a tremendous cost to the U.S. government. So if we forgive that, that needs to be replaced somewhere. That means another entitlement or another benefit is going to be reduced or eliminated. Or we'll look at the other side of the picture and say we need more income, right? We need more sources for this spending. And like I said, right now, that's either tax revenue or that's borrowing. Okay, so if we want more tax revenue, well, we need to go through all of that, talking about how are we going to raise more taxes? Or if we're not going to do that, likely the answer for the past several years has been, well, we'll just borrow more money. And we can maybe have another episode too on the consequences of borrowing. Or again, you can go grab my book. I don't mean to keep doing the self-promotion, but those are the exact things that I discuss in that book, kind of forecasting what the future may hold for our economy. And again, that's called What Should I Do With My Money? So I hope this helps. I just want to reference, where all of this data came from today, and I'll put it in the show notes as well. You're more than welcome to go on the internet. This is all public knowledge, but this came from the U.S. Treasury, the Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, the Office of Management and Budget, the Department of Defense, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So if you're an economist, you're going to love this stuff. If you're not, just spend a few minutes, get familiar with it so that when you see those withholdings on your paycheck and you go, what the heck, how come I'm losing so much money that I earned personally? Well, now you know where it's going and what it's for. All right. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to another episode of the Kuderna podcast. I'm your host, Bryan Kuderna. Please, wherever you're watching or listening, remember to leave us a review, subscribe, and tell a friend, and we will see you next time.
This podcast is intended for the general public and for informational purposes only. The show does not provide any recommendations or investment advice regarding any specific account type, service, strategy, or product, or to otherwise act in any fiduciary or other capacity. Please contact a financial professional for guidance and information that is specific to your situation. Bryan Kuderna does not provide tax or legal advice. Please contact your accountant or legal advisor to discuss your situation. Guest speakers and their firms are not affiliated with or endorsed by Park Avenue Securities, Guardian, or Kuderna Financial Team, and opinions stated are their own. All investments contain risk and may lose value. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. References to specific securities, asset classes, and financial markets are for illustrative purposes only and do not constitute a solicitation, offer, or recommendation to purchase or sell a security. Bryan Kuderna is a registered representative and financial advisor of Park Avenue Securities, LLC, PAS. OSJ 300 Broadacres Drive, Suite 175, Bloomfield, New Jersey, 07003. Phone number 973-244-4420. Securities products and advisory services offered through PAS, member FINRA SIPC. Financial representative of the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, Guardian, New York, New York. PAS is a wholly owned subsidiary of Guardian. Kuderna Financial Team is not an affiliate or subsidiary of PAS or Guardian. California Insurance License Number 0K04194.